Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the inaugural episode of the Impact Principles webinar series. First up, we wish you and your loved ones are doing well in these very unusual times. My name is Sharadia, and I'm an independent sustainable investment consultant, and I'm delighted to be joined on today's webinar by Diane Damsky, Head of Secretariat for the Operating Principles for Impact Management, or the Impact Principles, as we like to call them. The purpose of this webinar series is to host timely and insightful conversations with impact investing practitioners and understand the opportunities of impact investing across asset classes, across themes, and across regions, and understand how the principles are helping in the execution and monitoring of these investments. On today's episode, we will be first celebrating our 100th signatory milestone. We recently completed 1 year and also reached the 100th signatory milestone. Some of our signatories are on this call with us today. We will be sharing some key takeaways from year one, and then we will take your questions about the principles and their implementation. We will keep this short, so if we are unable to address some of your questions about the principles, please feel free to email us and we will try to get back to them. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Diane to formally give a shout out to our signatories and share key highlights of year one.
Thank you so much, Sharadia, and thank you all for joining us today in this first of the webinar series from the Impact Principles. We began this journey a few years ago and launched the principles on April of 2019. There were initially 58 signatories representing asset managers and asset owners from the public and private sectors. As Sharadia just mentioned, we have passed the 1 year mark and also recently recognized more than 100 signatories to the impact principles, and this represents over 30 countries. Interest in the impact principles continues to grow, as does the community of signatories. The impact principles were created to provide greater discipline, clarity, and transparency to the impact investing market. For example, signatories are required on an annual basis to provide a disclosure statement describing their impact management systems and processes. This must be publicly disclosed. And as you see the Growing Impact report here that was recently released by IFC, it features a chapter dedicated to case studies that were drafted by the signatories themselves, discussing how they implement each of the 9 principles. Several of the signatories have also prepared videos of their case studies, and we will be shortly releasing these on the website, the Impact Principles website. The impact principles also help mitigate the risk to impact washing, which was what we saw in the green bond market with green washing. So the principles provide a greater discipline to the market to prevent this type of activity in the market. As the number of signatories has grown, a community of collaboration and knowledge sharing has developed among the signatories. We provide numerous opportunities through webinars, conference calls, and workshops for these asset owners and asset managers to actively engage with each other on key areas of impact investing. They share experiences, they discuss how they implement the principles, challenges to impact investing, and also how they envision this market evolving over time. So these organizations that have stepped up to sign the principles are taking a leading role in the growth and evolution of this market.
Thank you, Dan. And at this point, we would like to take a moment to dwell on the recent challenges. The last few months have been particularly challenging for impact investors and impact investees, and yet the global community of impact investors has shown tremendous resilience and found innovative ways to continue serving their stakeholders. So we wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. And like the mainstream investment community, the impact investment communities also had to make certain adjustments and pivots, but for most part, they have stayed on course, and some of them have even upped their impact investing allocation. So Diane, what have you been seeing? How has the community stepped up? What has the response been? Are you continuing to get queries from all around the world about the principles?
Now, first and foremost, I'd like to highlight the fact that development finance institutions and multilateral development banks have increased or added resources dedicated to their constituents to address the additional challenges posed by COVID. So there has been IFC, CDC, and the others have all been increasing the resources dedicated to emerging markets and developing economies. We ourselves, we have actually experienced an increased interest in the impact principles and for potential signatories for the impact principles during this period. And we happily were welcoming the first signatory from Brazil, from India, and Costa Rica over the past 3 months. So there's an increasingly geographically diverse representation amongst the signatories to the principles.
Right. And we hope that the impact investing community emerges stronger on the other side of the crisis, and there is more investment opportunities and more capital being allocated towards these critical opportunities and causes and needs. On that note of hope, let's delve into the principles, shall we?
Absolutely. So these are the 9 impact principles. They provide a framework for investors to ensure that they can incorporate impact throughout the life of an investment. So ESG is the foundation for impact, and you see ESG incorporated here in Principle 5. So ESG is the foundation, and then impact is a layer of rigor beyond ESG alignment. So the 3 core components of the principles are intentionality, contribution, and measurability. So for intentionality, you must target an intentional impact at the outset of an investment. So it's an ex-ante intentionality. On contribution, you must be able to describe why your capital makes a difference to the level of impact achieved. And measurability, you must be able to measure the impact. The type of methodology that you use is really unique to your type of institution or the type of market in which you operate. There is no one way to measure impact. But the 3 components for the impact investors that sign on to the principles are intentionality, contribution, and measurability.
Excellent. So the current impact measurement and management landscape has multiple organizations that are unified by their shared mission of growing the impact investing capital pool. Diane, for our listeners, will you help us explain the landscape briefly, and also how the impact principles work with the other organizations in the space?
Absolutely. During the development of the impact principles, IFC engaged in an extensive consultation period with the broader market, with asset managers, asset owners, multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, academia, civil society, as well as other industry organizations. The GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, and IMP, Impact Management Project, are some of the key organizations for impact investing, and they were very involved throughout the development of the impact principles. And both the GIN and IMP are observers on the advisory board to the impact principles. So following the launch, there have been some initiatives that have grown out of the principles, and one that I would like to highlight is a steering group that is comprised of IFC, other development finance institutions, and signatories, and the GIN and IMP. And they're working on creating a harmonized set of indicators, impact indicators, that can be used across both public and private sector institutions. Many in the private sector use the IRIS Plus indicators that were developed by the GIN, and public sector institutions have used HIPSO, which stands for Harmonized Indicators for Private Sector Operations. While there is some overlap, it was deemed very important, now that these organizations are much more engaged with each other via the principles, to create a set of harmonized indicators, and they're doing it along thematic lines. So the first set of indicators that they have focused on are climate, gender, and jobs. This is an ongoing initiative, and there will be more information publicly available later on in this year. But that is one of the initiatives to come out of the principles being launched.
Wonderful. Greater engagement and collaboration, and we will keep an eye out for the harmonized metrics around climate, gender, and jobs. And on that note, let's get to the FAQ section. You have already alluded to this, but for clarity, would you help us explain the relationship of IFC to the principles?
Absolutely. So IFC, being one of the oldest and largest impact investors, was well positioned to lead on the development of the principles. There was a very positive reaction when we approached the GIN and IMP and other investors. So they took the lead on developing the principles and then were launched, as I mentioned, in April 2019. Following the launch, an independent secretariat was established to manage the outreach, the continued outreach, and the administration of the principles. And the secretariat is currently hosted by IFC. So the governance structure of the principles is the independent secretariat, as well as an advisory board. And Yen, if you go to the next slide, the advisory board these are signatories, and they were elected from amongst the other signatories, and they serve a two-year service as advisory board members, providing advice to the secretariat, to other signatories. They are the ambassadors for the principles. And as you see, the observers, the GIN and IMP, are also participating on the advisory board. IFC, as host of the principles, is also the chairman of the advisory board currently. We can go back to the previous slide.
Excellent. And now let's get into the mechanism of the actual implementation of the principles. So what types of organizations can sign on to the principles? Is it true that it only has to be private market investors? Is there a certain minimum AUM requirement?
The principles were written in a way so that they could be implemented by any type of impact investor, any size, any type of institution. So asset managers, asset owners, be it wealth managers, family offices. They also were written in a way that they could be applied to any type of asset class. While they're obviously easier to implement in the private markets where there's more direct connection to the ultimate investee, they can also be implemented in the publicly traded securities markets for equities and debt. The impact management systems that are used for those markets would obviously have to be different than in the private markets and just appropriate for that type of investment. But they were written in a way as to be able to encompass all types of investments, all types of impact investors anywhere in the world.
Got that. Yen, can we move on to the question at the heart of it? So why should one sign on to the principles? How can it help organizations that already have an existing impact investing program?
Well, the signatories that have come to sign the principles truly feel very proud to stand up and say, we adhere to a specific set of guidelines and principles in our impact investing discipline. So there's a transparency and discipline to their impact investing practices. Asset managers are able to distinguish themselves with their investors, saying that you see this track record, my reporting is publicly disclosed, and there's a better understanding of what it means to be a signatory now than there was a year ago. Asset owners use the principles to identify opportunities and also institutionalize their impact investing processes. What we're hearing increasingly is that asset owners and other investors are actually asking their asset managers if they're a signatory to the principles. So it's changing the conversation around impact investing and really raising the level of the conversation around impact investing and what it means to be an impact investor. Again, as I mentioned before, once you become a signatory, you also become part of this greater community of knowledge sharing and collaboration amongst all the signatories, asset owners, asset managers from all over the world.
Right. And what is the process to become a signatory? Is it a lengthy process? I'm asking this especially on behalf of the boutique and mid-sized managers on the call.
The process is actually quite simple because the organizations have done most of the hard work prior to approaching us to become a signatory. They've already established their impact management processes and systems. They've already determined what their impact measurement methodology is. So when you approach the Secretariat to inquire about becoming a signatory, we have a conversation to ensure that they're well understood, what is required of a signatory, address any other questions that you may have that are not addressed on the website or through this webinar. And then you receive the documentation, complete it, and return it to the Secretariat. And that is, then you become a signatory. Now, in these documents, you are affirming that you will align whatever designated fund strategies, lines of business that you say align with the principles, that you will align, that continue to align them with the principles. You will provide an annual disclosure statement within 1 year of signing. You will remit a one-time registration fee and also provide periodic independent verification of your impact management systems. But that is it to become a signatory.
Okay, so all potential signatories, it is a fairly simple, non-time consuming process.
Exactly.
So talking about at what level an entity should sign up. So should it be at the corporate level? Should it be at the fund or strategy level? And also, what if a firm has a mix of impact and non-impact strategies? At what level should they sign on?
I think that most signatories probably have a combination of impact and non-impact. And if you look at the list on the website, you will notice some of the very large organizations and diversified financial institutions have signed at the corporate level. And obviously not 100% of those firms is investing for impact. So they believe that signing at the corporate level shows that the importance that they attach to impact investing, but they also then have to delineate what are the lines of business, funds, strategies that will align with the principles. Since they have signed at the corporate level, they will be able to, over time, add or aggregate additional strategies that align with the principles under that same signatory letter. Other firms have signed at the fund level or investment strategy level, and that's really your decision. There is no one right way to do it, but the larger firms have found that they do envision having more impact strategies in the future. So they would like to sign at the corporate level so that they can just add them on over time.
Right. And do signatories have to demonstrate alignment to all the 9 principles?
Yes, as I mentioned before, everyone that has signed, they have already developed their impact management systems and processes. So at the time that they sign, they are already in alignment with all of the principles, but all of the principles are mandatory. So you must align with all of them.
And now coming to the annual disclosure requirement, how time consuming is this? Again, this applies to everyone, but especially for smaller firms. How time consuming do you think this process is?
This was a huge consideration when we were developing the principles. We heard far and wide that no one wants a multi-page, multi-week exercise to have to complete on an annual basis. The disclosure statement is a statement in which a signatory describes how their systems and processes allow them to align with each of the 9 principles. So since it's about the systems and processes, not the level of impact achieved or the quality of the system, unless your systems and processes change measurably on an annual basis, your disclosure statement should be relatively the same from year to year. There will be some modifications. You may improve your system slightly. You might want to add additional information in the disclosure statement, but the first disclosure statement is really what will probably take the most time as you determine what format you would like to use, what information you would like to include. And at this point on the website itself, there are more than 60 disclosure statements that you can look to as examples of how different types of institutions have prepared their disclosure statements. And there's a wide variety. So there is no one right way to do it. And it's really what is appropriate for your type of firm.
Right. And just to reiterate, if you go to our website and click on the signatory section, you will be able to view some of these statements that Diane just referenced. And now to the final question. What is the independent verification requirement? And is this similar to an external audit or assurance procedure?
Well, this is Principle 9. So the Principle 9 requirement was considered one of the key parts of the impact principles because all organizations can attest to the systems and processes that they have in place, but having the independent verification was critical to reducing the potential for impact washing. So we really see Principle 9 as the heart of the impact principles. However, when we say independent verification, it's most often misinterpreted to mean external. We did not, we drafted the principles so again, it was accessible to all sizes of organizations, and we did not want this to be a cost constraint or resource constraint for any signatory and prevent them from signing. So by independent verification, it may be an external firm, such as an audit firm, or an external committee, or it could be an internal department, an audit department of the signatory, or an internal committee that's independent from operations. So if you look again on the website, you'll see the verification summaries. There's all different types of independent verifiers, from the accounting firms to independent consultants. And then you'll see some very innovative ways of doing independent verification. And some of the smaller signatories, we had several conference calls on ways that this could be accomplished. One signatory has formed a committee of LPs, of their limited partners, that know their funds well, know impact investing, but they're independent from their operations. So these LPs are their independent verification committee. In Canada, there is an impact association called CAFID, and CAFID formed an independent committee that will perform this independent verification for their CAFID members. So there are a lot of innovative ways that some of the signatories have found to implement Principle 9, but again, it is not meant to be a cost constraint. And we have not found it to be so.
Right, and that should be reassuring to all potential signatories. And with that, we come to the end of the FAQs. Once again, thank you very much for your time. We hope that this webinar addressed most, if not all, your questions related to the principles. If you have other questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. And like we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is just the first episode of this series. So we will be having forthcoming episodes wherein we will be hosting practitioners and signatories and talking to them about a wide range of impact investing topics, and also hearing their firsthand experience of working with the principles. So stay tuned for that. And now I would like to hand it over to Diane for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Sharadia. Thank you all for joining us today. And as I know some of you have been in touch with us, if you have now decided that yes, you would like to move forward to become a signatory, please reach out. We'll have our conversation. I will send you the documentation, and we would love to welcome you and all of those interested to this growing community of signatories to the impact principles. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Thank you.